Okay, so I would like to talk about a phenomenon that I find interesting, and here are two examples of this phenomenon. On the left side we have Cecil the lion, this African lion that was unfortunately shot by hunters, and on the right side we have Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook profile photo. He, as like millions of other Facebook users, have changed their Facebook profile photos to rainbow colors to signal solidarity with the US legalization of gay marriage, as you all know. So what do these two examples have in common? Two things, I think. First, in both of these cases, millions of people publicly expressed their views on an emotional issue, on a moral issue, in a very emotional way, and they did so very loudly. It was ubiquitous on social media and everywhere. And then secondly, most of these people didn't take any further actions apart from just expressing their opinion to actually do something about it, to actually improve the welfare of animals, for example. And this discrepancy between expressing your moral view on an issue but not doing anything further about it, I think is interesting. And I call this phenomenon moral cheering. And I define it as publicly expressing your emotional view on a moral issue because it doesn't incur costs to do so and because it provides social benefits by signaling that you're a moral person. And as in these two examples that I showed before, I think emotions play a very important role in moral cheering. But interestingly, the emotions that people express when they engage in moral cheering are not necessarily emotions that are targeted towards the object of intended altruism, but much more towards the group of all the people who cheer together. So I think these emotions involved in moral cheering are emotions that foster group cohesion, such as righteousness, outrage, solidarity, and condemnation. And I think that's also interesting from an evolutionary point of view because maybe moral cheering is an evolutionary adaptive strategy. Yeah, and the causes of moral cheering are always causes that are socially accepted within your group. So this might be relative to which group you're part of. Yeah, and examples of such causes might be the current refugee crisis, gay rights, women's rights, wild animal hunting, or the ice bucket challenge, and many other examples. And as I already said, people who engage in moral cheering usually don't go about and take any further actions to actually do something about the cause. And in particular, they don't take any actions that are effortful or demanding. Because if you're really interested in helping or improving wild animal, in improving the life of wild animals, of course, then you should go about and do some research and maybe donate large amounts of your money. But that's not what people seem to be doing. So moral cheering, of course, is not necessarily the most effective way to improve the world. And we as effective altruists are, of course, aware of that. And we know that if you really want to have an impact in the world, a large impact, then this might incur some costs. So yeah, as I said, if you're really interested in gay rights, right, then you might want to try to advocate gay rights in countries like Russia, where gay rights are not very common yet. Or you might want to advocate women's rights in India or Saudi Arabia. Or if you're interested in helping animals, then you shouldn't just post, or just posting some cute photos on Facebook isn't enough, but maybe you want to try to go vegan or spread veganism. But all of these causes are very costly. So first, it's socially very costly because these are all not socially accepted causes. And we all know that people really hate moral saints, people who go around and behave in a moralizing way. And you might have to donate large amounts of your money, you might have to change your eating habits, or you might have to invest into researching, figuring out how to actually have an impact. And yeah, unfortunately there are not so many effective altruists yet, but there are millions of people who engage in moral cheering, even though it's not necessarily the most effective way to improve the world. So does this mean that people are not really altruistic? Do people not really care? This is of course an empirical question, and psychologists and behavioral economists have tried to answer this question since decades. And in particular, one branch of research in behavioral economics has tried to tackle this question with experiments with economic games, or maybe you have heard of these games. So one of the most prominent games is called the dictator games, where two participants interact anonymously with each other, and one participant is assigned the role of a dictator, and he is endowed with some initial amount of money, like $10, and then he or she can decide how much of this amount he or she wants to transfer to the other person. And there will be no further consequences. So someone who's purely selfish will, of course, not give any money to the other person. But in fact, what behavioral economists have found all across the world in hundreds of studies is that people on average are actually really fair. So on average, they give about 30 to 50% of their endowment to the other person. And so behavioral economists have concluded that people have what they call social preferences, that they actually care about helping others and achieving a fair outcome and doing something altruistic. But then more recent studies have questioned this assumption. And there's some really cool studies that are not that well known. And one, I'm just going to talk about one of these studies, and it's called the Quiet Exit in Dictator Game. And it's a modified version of the Dictator Game. And in this modified version of the Dictator Game, after the dictator made his decision, but before its execution, the experimenter confronts the dictator and makes him an offer. He tells him, so you have two options. Either you can go ahead and execute your decision and make the split as you decided. Or you can choose to take $9 and give $1 to me, and then you can go home, and I won't tell the other participants about this dictator game in the first place. So basically you can pay $1 and go home with 9, and you can, by doing so, you can eliminate the expectation of the other person. And in fact, a large proportion of people or participants choose this option. And this shows that people are kind of hypocritical. So people aren't, or at least not everyone is really interested in achieving a fair outcome per se. It seems that people are much more interested in appearing fair to others and maybe to themselves, and in retaining a good self-image of themselves. People want to see themselves as being moral and altruistic, but they want to do that while remaining as selfish as possible. And I think that moral cheering might be a strategy to serve that goal, right? Because you can signal to others and to yourself that you're moral, but it's not at all costly to do so. So why is it then that people don't go ahead and take any further action beyond moral cheering? And I think that this is because people can fool themselves into believing that they don't have to. They can fool themselves into believing that moral cheering is enough. And they do so in a process of rationalizing. And this is a behavior that you probably all observed in yourself or with other people. People often, when we talk to people and try to explain to them the importance of donating to effective charities, for example, or the importance of going vegan or spreading veganism, people often have lots of excuses why they think they don't have to. And I think that these excuses are often dishonest excuses. So for example, people might say, well, I don't think I need to donate because the money doesn't reach the people anyway, or the people are too far away and I don't have an obligation because of the distance, or I don't need to go vegan because it's normal or it's natural, etc. But these arguments, it seems, are not necessarily morally sound arguments, but they seem to be rationalizations, dishonest excuses that are rooted in cognitive biases, such as risk aversion or status quo bias or nature bias, and etc. And this, of course, can happen unconsciously. So this can also happen to us, or does happen to us all the time. So what can we do to actually change people's behavior and make them behave in a moral way beyond moral cheering? And I think there are two strategies. Either we can nudge people, which means that we can change the decisional environment in such a way that they will automatically choose a more altruistic option. So for example, if it's the default option to choose the vegetarian option, then most people would actually choose the vegetarian option. And the second strategy would be to de-bias people. Because if people are aware of risk aversion, status quo bias, nature bias, etc., then they would realize that these excuses that they bring for why they believe that they don't have to go beyond moral cheering and do something costly, these excuses, they will realize that these excuses don't hold and that they're dishonest. And then at some point, people will realize that the only way to actually preserve your self-image is actually to do something, to choose a costly option and improve the world in an effective way. And moral tutoring alone will not be sufficient anymore to tell yourself that you're moral. So, even though moral tutoring is very widespread and debiasing is very difficult, there still has been a tremendous amount of moral progress, as we all know. And Steven Pinker wrote this great book, Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he summarizes how moral progress has been achieved over the last millennia. And the fact that people cheer for gay rights today is a testament to the extent of this moral progress. But unfortunately, this progress has been uneven because people get really outraged when. We're in a situation where we have a paradox where people are really outraged because of this unfortunate deaths of Cecil the lion, but at the same time they might be eating a beef burger, and this is just a massive inconsistency in moral progress. But this begs the question: so how has moral progress been possible so far? And interestingly, moral progress has not been a gradual process of changes in maturity views, as one might assume. And this is because the really important causes are usually very costly, and most people don't focus on costly causes. Instead, it has been only moral progress has been achieved by those very few intellectuals who were courageous enough to incur the costs and the risks to actually push forward new rational arguments that may appear very weird and may be socially very costly, such as Jeremy Bentham, for example, who introduced utilitarianism, or Mary Wollstonecraft, who's a philosopher and an early women's rights advocate, Peter Singer, of course, who initiated the animal rights movement, Nick Bostrom, who makes aware of the dangers of AI risks, or David Pearce, who talks about the promises of bioengineering and the abolition of suffering, or Brian Tomasics, who writes extensively about the importance of helping wild animals. These have been, or still are, very weird moral issues, and it's only due to these courageous people that we can make moral progress, I think. Yeah, because these rational arguments push the boundaries of morality forward. And this is done by a process called norm cascade. So first, when a new moral issue arises, such as, for example, death penalty. Death penalty was common throughout the world, everywhere historically, but it isn't anymore in many liberal countries today. So first, when there's an intense controversy about a moral issue, and then the elites, such as politicians, for example, are influenced by these rational arguments, and they defy popular opinion. They push through a new norm, for example, politically. And then what happens is that nothing bad happens, and everyone realizes that actually it was not at all a bad decision. And people get bored, the media gets bored, they won't write about it anymore, people get used to it, they will just accept the status quo, and the alternatives become unthinkable. And at this point, a tipping point was reached where the payoffs change. And actually, at this point, it's not costly anymore to support this cause. It might even be costly to support the alternative, and then people start to cheer for it. And this is just... on this one slide, I want to talk about a possible analogy which I find quite interesting. And so far I've talked about moral beliefs, right? But I think there's an analogy to epistemic beliefs as well. And one example would be New Atheism. And as much as I personally agree with many ideas in the New Atheism movement, I sometimes wonder whether the proponents of the New Atheism movement actually care about the truth and making epistemic progress, or whether they're more interested in just cheering. Because it's really easy, at least today in Europe, to be an atheist. It's not a difficult epistemic belief to state publicly, but it was very, very costly 100 years ago. And similarly, it was costly to publicly state that you believe in heliocentric worldview or in evolution a few centuries ago. And there might be other epistemic beliefs that might still be costly, at least to some extent today in some circles, such as, in some circles it might be costly to state that you believe that there might be innate psychological gender differences, differences between the gender, or that you believe in reductionism, or that you believe in weird worldviews such as the simulation hypothesis or AI risks. But it might be that these views might not be weird anymore a few years down the line. So I think that's an interesting analogy. But now let's go back to the moral domain. So I've talked about moral progress, and this is of course an interesting subject for us as effective altruists, because that's what we are ultimately interested in. And I think today we are in a very good position compared to our predecessors, because first we can learn from our predecessors, we can build on the previous progress, and we can learn from their mistakes. And then also the costs today, our costs are much smaller, right? So 500 years ago, we probably would have all been burned alive at the stake for what we were doing, what we were talking about. But today, luckily, we have free speech, and the costs are very small comparatively. And then we have all of many new tools, such as social media, which helps us to find similarly minded people and quickly grow new movements, such as the EA movement, and spread messages to millions of people. And now, just a final thought. So probably we all agree that moral cheering in itself isn't necessarily the most effective way to improve the world, but it's not clear whether the impact of moral cheering is in total positive or negative. And first, I think one might say maybe it's negative because it might prevent people from doing actual help. And there's this phenomenon called moral licensing, which describes people's tendency to not help anymore after they already done something good before, because now they believe they have their license to refrain from further moral actions because they have already done something good, and maybe because people believe that moral cheering might be an altruistic act, then they might believe that now they don't have to do any further altruistic actions. But then I believe the moral cheering might be very positive because it strengthens existing moral norms, which is very good if the norms are good. And finally, I believe also for us as effective altruists, moral cheering might actually be a good instrumental strategy to draw attention to more important causes. So we can kind of ride the wave of moral issues such as Cecil the lion, for example, and then we can draw attention to wild animal suffering or to animal welfare in general. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.